I learned something strange about people the year they try to take 12 feet of my land. Not 12 acres, not some forgotten corner nobody cared about, just 12 feet along the edge of a pasture I'd walked almost every day for 19 years. Funny thing is, it wasn't really about the land. At least not for me. For them, maybe. For me, it became about something else entirely the moment a man in a polo shirt smiled at me and said, "Come on, Wade. Nobody's even using that strip anyway." That was the exact moment I stopped being reasonable. Now, before I get into that, let me tell you where this happened. I live outside a little town called Dry Creek, Tennessee. Population small enough that most people wave whether they know you or not. My farm sits on about 40 acres of rolling pasture and oak trees. Nothing fancy. I raise cattle, fix equipment, drink too much coffee, and spend more time talking to animals than people. That's the life I wanted after spending 20 years hauling freight across the country. When I finally bought that land, every fence post, every gate, every shed represented years of work. I wasn't born into money. Nobody handed me anything. So maybe that's why property lines mean something different to me than they do to people who spend their afternoons arguing over mailbox colors at HOA meetings. The trouble started when a new development went up beside my property. It used to be soybean fields. Then a developer bought the land, cleared everything, and built one of those picture-perfect neighborhoods with matching roofs, decorative street lamps, and signs about community values. At first, I didn't care. People can live however they want. The only thing our property shared was a boundary line running along my western pasture. For about a year, everything stayed peaceful. Then the developer handed control over to a newly elected homeowners association. That's when things started changing. New fences appeared, new landscaping projects, new rules. Every few weeks, I'd see somebody measuring something or putting up another sign. Still, none of that was my problem. Or so I thought. One morning in early spring, I was driving my utility vehicle out toward the cattle when something caught my eye. There was a brand new cedar fence running along part of the property line. At first, I figured one of the homeowners had upgraded their backyard. Then I looked again. Something felt off. The fence wasn't where the old markers had always been. I parked and walked closer. The farther I walked, the tighter my jaw got. The fence wasn't sitting on their side. It was sitting on mine. Not by inches, by feet. I went back to the house and dug through a file cabinet where I kept every survey, permit, and property record I'd collected over the years. My late wife, Emily, used to joke that I organized paperwork better than the county office. Turns out that habit paid off. 2 hours later, I was standing in that pasture with survey stakes, measurements, and a growing sense that somebody had made a very expensive mistake. The fence was 12 feet inside my property line. 12 feet across nearly 200 yards of boundary. That's a lot more land than it sounds like. I remember just standing there staring at it while 3 cows watched me like they were waiting for instructions. One of them actually nudged the fence with her nose. I laughed because if I didn't laugh, I was probably going to get angry. That evening, I drove over to the HOA office. It occupied a small brick building near the neighborhood entrance. Everything inside smelled like fresh paint and expensive furniture. Behind the front desk sat a woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. A few minutes later, I was sitting across from the HOA manager, a guy named Brent Holloway. Brent had perfect hair, perfect teeth, and the kind of confidence people get when they've never heard the word no very often. I spread my survey across his desk. "Your fence is on my property," I told him. "I figured you'd want to know before it becomes a bigger problem." He barely looked at the map. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "We've already reviewed the project," he said. "Everything was approved." I slid the survey closer. "Approved or not, it's still on my land." He glanced down for maybe 2 seconds before shrugging. Then came the sentence I still remember word for word. "Come on, Wade. Nobody's even using that strip anyway." I actually thought he was joking. When I realized he wasn't, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's your legal argument?" I asked. "That I wasn't using it?" He smiled like we were discussing the weather. "Let's not make this difficult." That's when something shifted inside me. You ever meet someone who mistakes patience for weakness? Someone who assumes because you're calm, you'll eventually roll over? Brent was one of those people. I left that office without raising my voice. But on the drive home, I kept hearing that sentence in my head. Nobody's using it anyway. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd already made up my mind. They weren't dealing with someone who planned to surrender 12 feet of land because it was convenient. They were dealing with a farmer who had spent 19 years protecting every inch of what he'd built. And if they wanted to fight, well, they were about to get one. The next morning, I started making phone calls. Now, I'm not one of those people who runs to lawyers every time life gets inconvenient. Most problems can be solved with a conversation, a handshake, maybe a little common sense. The trouble was, I'd already tried the conversation part, and Brent had made it clear exactly how much respect he had for my property rights. So I called the county survey office first. Then I called the zoning department. After that, I filed a formal encroachment complaint. The woman who handled the paperwork sounded almost bored until I mentioned the measurements. Then her tone changed. Apparently 12 feet wasn't exactly a minor issue. A county inspector named Harold Benson came out the following week. Harold was the kind of government employee people don't make movies about. Gray hair, dusty boots, old pickup truck. The kind of guy who cared more about facts than opinions. We spent nearly 3 hours walking the property. He checked markers, reviewed records, compared surveys, and measured everything twice. By the end of the afternoon, he shook his head and said, "Well, this one's easy. They're definitely over the line." Hearing that felt good, but it wasn't exactly a victory. The county issued a notice requiring the HOA to correct the encroachment. Problem solved, right? Not even close. 2 weeks passed. Nothing happened. The fence stayed exactly where it was. Then 3 weeks. Then 4. Finally, I called Harold again. He sounded irritated before I even finished explaining. "They received the notice," he said. "They acknowledged the notice. They just haven't complied with it." That was the first time I realized this wasn't a mistake anymore. A mistake gets corrected. This had become a decision. They had decided my land was worth more to them than following the rules. A few days later, I ran into one of the homeowners from the development at a gas station. Nice guy named Carl. We'd spoken a few times before. While we were filling our trucks, he lowered his voice and said, "You didn't hear this from me, but people have been talking." "Talking about what?" I asked. He looked around before answering. "The board wants to expand the greenbelt area along your property line. They think it improves home values." Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about a fence. The fence was just step one. They wanted a wider buffer zone to make the neighborhood look more upscale. Somebody had probably looked at a map and decided taking a slice of farmer's pasture would be easier than redesigning their plans. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not because of the land itself, but because of the attitude behind it. Nobody had asked. Nobody had negotiated. They simply took it and expected me to accept the loss. About a month after the county notice, Brent showed up at my farm. I was repairing a gate when his SUV rolled into the driveway. He stepped out wearing sunglasses and confidence. "Wade," he called. "Thought we should talk." I set my wrench down. "Funny. I thought we already did." He smiled. "Look, let's be practical. The homeowners have invested a lot of money in that fence. Moving it would create unnecessary costs. Then maybe they shouldn't have built it on my property." His smile tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." There was again that assumption that I should be the one compromising. Brent spent the next 10 minutes explaining why the HOA deserved flexibility, why the neighborhood benefited from the fence placement, why everyone would appreciate my cooperation. Not once did he acknowledge the simple fact that the land wasn't theirs. Finally, I interrupted him. "Let me ask you something. If I parked a barn 12 feet into your neighborhood entrance, would you call that cooperation?" His expression changed immediately. Just for a second. Long enough for me to see the irritation underneath the polished professionalism. Then he climbed back into his SUV and left. Watching him drive away, I realized something important. They weren't worried. They believed eventually I'd get tired, frustrated, or intimidated. They expected time to work in their favor. That's when the idea started forming. Not all at once, more like a seed. Every morning, I'd walk that boundary line. Every evening, I'd stare at the fence. And the same thought kept returning. If they wanted to pretend that land didn't matter, maybe it was time I reminded them exactly what land was for. About 2 weeks later, I called an old friend named Earl Simmons. Earl had built agricultural structures all over 3 counties. If you needed a barn, equipment shed, livestock shelter, or storage building, Earl was your guy. He drove out one Saturday morning carrying blueprints and a tape measure. We spent hours walking the property. Eventually, he stopped near the disputed boundary and looked at me. "You planning what I think you're planning?" he asked. I nodded. Earl started laughing so hard he nearly dropped his clipboard. The structure wasn't illegal. It wasn't a loophole. It wasn't even unusual for a working farm. I genuinely needed additional storage space for hay and equipment. The only unusual thing was the location. The new barn would run almost the entire length of that section of pasture, sitting comfortably on my side of the legal property line. Very comfortably. Every permit was filed correctly. Every inspection requirement was met. Every setback regulation was satisfied. I wasn't interested in cutting corners. In fact, I wanted the project to be so thoroughly legal that nobody could question it. Construction began 6 weeks later. The first day workers arrived, several homeowners gathered along the fence to watch. By the second day, rumors were flying through the neighborhood. By the third day, Brent appeared again. This time he looked less confident. "What exactly are you building?" he asked. "A barn," I said. "Looks pretty large. Hay takes up space." He stared at the framing for a long moment. "Seems awfully close to the fence." I smiled. Funny how property lines work. For the first time since this whole mess started, Brent didn't have an answer. The barn went up fast. Steel roof. Heavy timber construction. Wide enough for equipment, feed storage, and livestock shelter. By the end of the month, it dominated that side of the pasture. Then came the cattle, and the hay, and the daily farm activity that naturally follows when a working barn starts operating exactly as intended. Within days, complaints started surfacing throughout the HOA. Apparently, people who enjoy the rustic charm of country living don't always enjoy the actual realities of livestock. Trucks delivering feed, equipment moving through the pasture, the occasional smell drifting across the fence on warm afternoons. Nothing excessive, nothing unusual, just ordinary farm life. The same farm life that had existed there long before the subdivision was built. One afternoon, I was stacking hay when 2 board members marched across the grass toward me. One of them, a woman named Linda Parker, looked absolutely furious. "This is affecting property values," she snapped. "You built that thing out of spite." I leaned against a hay bale. "Actually, I built it on my property. You know exactly what you're doing." Doi. Her face turned red. The truth was, I didn't know exactly what I was doing. I was exercising rights they thought didn't matter. Every complaint they made only highlighted the irony. For months, they'd argued 12 feet wasn't important. Suddenly, every inch seemed very important indeed. Then, just when tensions were reaching a boiling point, the county delivered another update. One that would change everything and put the HOA in a position they never saw coming. The county's second notice arrived about 3 weeks after Linda's little visit, and this one carried a lot more weight than the first. Up until then, the HOA had been treating the whole situation like an inconvenience they could eventually outlast. But now the file had moved beyond routine compliance and into formal enforcement territory. In plain English, the county was done asking nicely. The fence had to go. Not eventually. Not when it was convenient. It had to be removed. I found out before Brent did, because Harold called me directly. I was repairing a water trough when my phone rang. "Thought you want to know," he said. "The county's moving forward." I thanked him, hung up, and just stood there for a minute staring across the pasture. The barn sat exactly where it was supposed to, solid and permanent against the afternoon sky. Cattle grazed nearby. Hay was stacked inside. Everything about it looked ordinary. That's what made the situation so beautiful. There was nothing dramatic about the structure itself. The drama came from the fact that the HOA had backed themselves into a corner they created with their own arrogance. A week later, I received notice that the HOA's attorneys wanted to discuss a settlement. Now, that was interesting. For months, I'd been the unreasonable farmer, the stubborn guy making trouble over a strip of land nobody supposedly used. Suddenly, they wanted to talk. We met in a conference room downtown. Brent was there. Linda was there. Two lawyers were there. The atmosphere felt completely different from our first meeting. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the assumption that I'd eventually give up. One attorney cleared his throat and said, "We're hoping to find a practical solution." I almost laughed. Practical. That word again. Apparently practical only became important once they were the ones paying the bill. They proposed easements. They proposed compensation. They proposed partial agreements. What they never proposed was admitting they should have listened from the beginning. Finally, I looked across the table at Brent. "Let me ask you something," I said. "Do you remember what you told me the first day I came to your office?" His eyes narrowed. "Not specifically. You told me nobody was using that strip anyway." The room went quiet. Turns out somebody was. Nobody said a word after that. The meeting ended without an agreement. A month later, the court issued its ruling. The fence had to be removed entirely from my property. Legally speaking, that should have been the end of the story. But reality had one final twist waiting. You see, when the HOA built that fence, they had easy access from both sides. When the court ordered it removed, conditions were very different. My barn now occupied nearly the entire length of the legal boundary. There was limited room for equipment, limited room for workers, limited room for anything. The same people who once dismissed 12 feet as insignificant suddenly discovered 12 feet can become extremely valuable when you need it to perform construction work. The removal process took weeks. Workers couldn't simply knock sections down. They had to dismantle everything piece by piece, panel by panel, post by post. Every extra hour meant additional labor costs. Every complication meant additional expenses. I watched part of the process from my pasture. Not every day. I wasn't interested in gloating. At least that's what I told myself. Truth is, there were a few mornings when I'd carry a cup of coffee out to the barn and quietly enjoy the view. One afternoon, a worker actually laughed while loading materials onto a trailer. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "whoever planned this fence really screwed up." I couldn't argue with that. The final bill reportedly reached well into 5 figures. I never learned the exact number. Different homeowners told different stories. Some blamed the board. Some blamed the developer. Some blamed Brent. What I do know is that several board members quietly resigned within the following year. Brent eventually disappeared from the HOA altogether. Last I heard, he took a management position somewhere 2 counties away. Maybe he learned something from the experience. Maybe he didn't. As for me, life returned to normal. The cattle still wandered the pasture. The barn still stored hay. The sun still came up over the same fields every morning. Yet something about me had changed. For a long time, I thought the story was about winning, about proving a point, about making somebody pay for disrespecting my property rights. But as the years passed, I realized the lesson was simpler than that. Boundaries matter, not just property lines, personal boundaries, community boundaries, the invisible lines that allow people to live beside one another without constantly taking what isn't theirs. The HOA never really lost because of the money. They lost because they convinced themselves rules applied differently when they were the ones making them. And that's a mistake people make everywhere, every day. Sometimes in neighborhoods, sometimes in businesses, sometimes in families. The moment you start believing your goals justify crossing someone else's line, you're already heading toward trouble. Every now and then I still walk past that barn and glance toward the place where the fence used to stand. Most people would probably see an ordinary structure. I see a reminder that respect costs nothing, but arrogance can get very expensive. And here's the part that still starts arguments whenever I tell this story. Some folks say I should have accepted compensation and moved on. Others say I was absolutely right to stand my ground. Honestly, even now, I'm not sure everyone will agree with how I handled it. Maybe that's why the story keeps getting people talking. So let me ask you this. If someone knowingly took 12 feet of your property and then told you it wasn't a big deal, what would you have done? Would you have accepted a check and let it go? Or would you have fought to protect what was yours? Drop your answer in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you stand on it. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, small-town conflicts, and ordinary people pushing back when they're underestimated, make sure to like the video subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next one. Trust me, this isn't the craziest story I've got.